Hello and welcome to Maximum Thom Yorke, the first talking book about the artist. It was written and researched by Ben Graham, music is by Amanda Thompson, and it's read by Sian Jones. You can check out our full catalogue on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk.
We stopped about 2.5 years ago, the band that I'm in, called Radiohead, and one of the things that I had wanted to do for ages was to get stuck into a bunch of things that I've been mucking around with which didn't fit. If it was a solo album, that would it would demand that, that I'd walked away from the Radiohead thing, which it basically hadn't, and half the reason for doing it was because it's something I'd wanted to do for ages.
In the mid-1990s, following the suicide of Kurt Cobain and the disappearance of Ritchie from the Manic Street Preachers, Thom Yorke was considered by many to be a new figurehead of a depressive rock generation, as well as the next pop star most likely to kill himself. The Radiohead singer has spoken openly about his personal battles with depression, but he's made it clear he's never looked for pity or sympathy. He maintains that many creative people have difficulty coping with day-to-day life. But then so do many non-creative people, and they don't have the relief of being able to express themselves through art. He says he'd rather experience all the highs and lows of life than be happy all the time, but resist the role of some kind of icon of gloom. Creep and the bends notwithstanding, he has angrily warned fans not to write to him with their problems. He insists he has never wanted to glamorise depression. If anything, the message he wants to put out is not to give in to any of it. And yet Thom Yorke is a mass of contradictions. What are we to make of this global rock star, leader of one of the biggest and most critically acclaimed bands in the world, who seems almost pathologically uncomfortable with attention and consumed with doubt, insecurity and self-loathing? Shy, uncommunicative and socially awkward, he has nevertheless penned and sung some of the most moving and powerful lyrics of his generation that people all around the world have been able to empathise with. He hates touring, is scornful of the sex, drug and rock and roll's cliché, and has never been inclined to go to film premieres, glitzy nightclubs, or otherwise live out the celebrity lifestyle. Instead, he's become increasingly politically involved, speaking out against war and on behalf of the environment, while vehemently expressing his contempt for politics in general and the vast majority of politicians in particular. Short, frail, pallid and unconventional looking, mainly due to his partly paralysed left eye, Thom Yorke is nevertheless not as freakish looking as many of his detractors have claimed. But his appearance is exaggerated by his body language, especially on stage, when he seems to twist and writhe as though desperate to get out of his skin. Hunched up and turning in on himself, shaking his head autistically from side to side, jerking and fidgeting neurotically. Thom has expressed his disdain for performers who over-emote and try to express a song theatrically, reaching out as if to embrace the crowd. But he has taken his performance to the other extreme, emphasising his shyness, alienation and discomfort on stage, like, to borrow the title of his 1998 collaboration with DJ Shadow, a rabbit in the headlights. Ultimately, Thom Yorke is a human being, with all the complexity that implies, trying to stay real and retain his integrity in an increasingly artificial environment. We've come to expect pop stars to be empty, two-dimensional stereotypes. Thom Yorke is trying to be more than that. It's no wonder we're confused.
You could sort of call it a side project, that would make more sense, but side project demands that it wasn't, it was just a doodle, but it wasn't. I mean, I really went for it with Nigel. It was a proper thing. We were trying our best.
Thomas Edward Yorke was born on the 7th of October 1968 in Wellingborough, Northamptonshire. His father, Graham Yorke, was an equipment supplier to the chemical engineering industry. His mother, Barbara, was a primary school teacher. The family was later joined by a younger brother, Andrew. Tom was born with a paralysed left eye permanently fixed shut. His parents took him to see a specialist eye doctor who suggested that a muscle graft onto the affected area might help, and to this end Tom was forced to undergo 5 separate eye operations before his 6th birthday. These eventually opened up his left eye, but Tom spent the first year at school wearing an eye patch which inevitably singled him out for bullying, ridicule and unwanted attention that made him painfully shy and self-conscious. Tom claims the last operation was actually botched, leaving him with his trademark lazy eye and his left lid drooping lower than the other. He says, "I went half blind. I can kind of see. I can judge if I'm going to hit something, but that's just about it." Tom spent these early years in Scotland, where his family moved due to his father's job. Until he was 7, Tom's family lived on a bleak, remote area of the Scottish coast, close to an abandoned Second World War sea fort, surrounded by barbed wire and crumbling barricades. Leaving Scotland, Tom was forced to say goodbye to his classmate, Katie Ganson, who he had sworn to marry but never saw again. His nomadic childhood would be marked by similar temporary friendships and relationships suddenly torn apart. This inevitably led Tom to become introverted and self-sufficient, with a fear of letting anyone get too close to him, as the pattern of his life suggested that they would soon painfully abandon him again. "There's a pervading sense of loneliness I've had since the day I was born," he said. He withdrew into himself and, like many future artists, spent his childhood working on his own solitary projects, playing with Lego, working and riding on his bike, and designing and drawing cars. In 1976, the Yorke family moved back to England and continued to move around until mid-1978, when they settled for good in the village of Witney in Oxfordshire, just a few miles west of the dreaming spires of Oxford itself. Tom attended Standlake Primary School, where his mother also found herself a job. He was teased and bullied incessantly, getting into fights which he invariably lost, admitting that he had inherited from his father the kind of face that people wanted to punch. His father had dealt with this by becoming a prize-winning boxer while at college, but when Graham Yorke tried to teach his son the noble art, success eluded him. "One of the first things he ever bought me was a pair of boxing gloves," Tom later remembered. "He used to try to teach me to box, but whenever he hit me, I'd fall flat on my ass." In spite of this, as Tom grew older, he seemed almost to go out of his way to look for trouble. He became increasingly belligerent, argumentative and confrontational, and refused to back down whenever he was taunted or challenged. He began to assume that people were going to attack or abuse him, and often got in first in self-defence. He would deliberately get in people's faces and challenge them to antagonise him. For his 8th birthday, Tom's parents bought him a cheap Spanish-style acoustic guitar, hoping to encourage his newly awakened interest in rock music, in particular the camp, bombastic, baroque metal epics of Queen. Tom had actually first picked up a guitar at the age of 4, but the steel strings had hurt his fingers, so he'd thrown the instrument against a wall, destroying it. This time, however, Tom decided to begin by seeking professional advice and started going to guitar lessons. He outlined his expectations at the very first session, where the 8-year-old told his bemused teacher, "I want to be Brian May." Despite being only able to play Kumbaya by the age of 9, Tom was telling his parents decisively that he was going to be a rock star, and by the age of 10 he'd formed his first band, a primary school duo featuring Tom on guitar and a friend whose party trick was miswiring television sets so they'd explode. His first song was entitled Mushroom Cloud. It was the first manifestation of an apocalyptic worldview that would become one of the defining features of the adult Thom Yorke songwriting.
The initial musical ideas were written in a sleepless night in New York, where it chucked down rain the size of tennis balls all night long, and just listening to that sound all night long with my laptop and not being able to sleep, but sort of it came from really.
In September 1980, Thom's parents enrolled him as a day boarder at Abingdon Public School, a boys-only institution founded in 1256, a few miles southeast of Oxford and one of the oldest public schools in England. The school day was a tough 8:35 a.m. to 5 p.m, with a half day on Saturday morning to boot. Thom continued to be mercilessly ragged and bullied by his fellow pupils, and his unusual appearance soon earned him the hated nickname Salamander. The particular focus of Thom's own hatred, though, was not his fellow pupils, but Abingdon's headmaster at the time, one Michael St John Parker, nicknamed the Beak by the student body, partly on account of his prominent nose. Parker would roam the school dressed in old-fashioned black robes like some vision straight out of Tom Brown's School Days, and would preside over the twice-weekly chapel sessions, delivering a sombre sermon from the pulpit, despite the fact that he had no formal qualifications to do so. In Thom's eyes, this was sheer fraudulent hypocrisy, and he believed the headmaster guilty of impersonating a church minister. He was a power-crazy lunatic, evil, petty little man with ridiculous sideburns who used to flick his hair across his head to hide his bald patch, Thom later said, the intervening years obviously not having mellowed his feelings towards his old head teacher. Parker was the subject of the Thom Yorke song Bishop's Robes, released as a Radiohead B-side in 1996. Introducing it live on stage in Stockholm the previous year, Thom said, "This is about an old headmaster that we had. He suddenly decided that he was close to God because he was a useless headmaster. The guy was a fascist idiot, and this is about him." Of course, the most valuable thing that Thom would take away from Abingdon was his friendship with 4 of his fellow pupils: Colin Greenwood, Ed O'Brien, Phil Selway, and Colin's younger brother Johnny. Thom and Colin had, at the age of 14, both been members of a school punk band called TNT, with Thom becoming the vocalist by default. He had a cheap microphone but no stand, so he tied the mic to a broomstick. When the rest of the band saw this, they all fell about laughing. "This was my introduction to singing," Thom later recalled. TNT proved a good laugh and an excuse to make an enjoyably antisocial noise. But after about a year, both Thom and Colin left, hoping to pursue less limited musical ventures. For Thom, most prominent among these was an ongoing open-ended collaboration with a classmate named Donald Gawthorne. Gawthorne was a talented piano and keyboard player, and in November 1984, the pair provided the musical backing for a school production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, appearing up on a tower improvising free-form jazz. Eventually, however, Thom's musical ambitions focused on a loose group he had formed alongside Colin, Ed and Phil, known after various short-lived names as On a Friday, because that was the only day of the week they got to rehearse. On a Friday, dressed in black, played very loudly and were influenced by Joy Division, Magazine, The Smiths, The Fall and R.E.M. Pretty soon they began performing at parties, and by the time Thom left school in 1987, they produced a 6-song demo tape and played their first club show at Oxford's Jericho Tavern, with Colin's younger brother Johnny making his debut appearance with the band. By this time, both Phil and Ed had left for university, and Colin was soon to follow, but the band vowed to continue, albeit temporarily on a part-time basis. Thom took a year out, working briefly in the menswear department of a local department store, but the manager was unimpressed by his long blonde hair, Oxfam suit, and disinterested attitude to the customers. When asked why he hadn't sold any suits, Thom allegedly replied, "Because they're crap and no one wants to buy them." When he was accused of stealing stock, he handed in his notice and took a job in a bar, where he was approached by a woman who told him, "You have beautiful eyes, but they're completely wrong." Another job as an orderly in a mental hospital would later inspire the Radiohead song Climbing Up the Walls. Thom also wasted no time in learning to drive, but his love of cars, nurtured since early childhood, came to an abrupt end after an auto accident, which resulted in him completely wrecking his car. There were no serious injuries, but it was the beginning of a deep mistrust and fear of cars and of mechanised transport generally, which would become a near obsessive feature of Thom's songwriting for years to come.
Like there was initial sessions before Nigel got there where I was like just working out how to make the computers work. All I had was the technology, and only half of it was working. It was quite a, there's definitely a few weeks of what am I doing, Once actually I sat down with Nigel, went through basic ideas. It was like, oh well, hang on, there is something here.
In the autumn of 1988, Thom surprised his parents by taking off for Exeter University to study English and art, although he didn't exactly take to student life with enthusiasm. Despite its proximity to the beautiful Devon countryside, he found Exeter soulless and homogenised, full of people who were sleepwalking their way through life. If anything, his fellow students seemed even worse, drunken, privileged idiots who arrived in the town uninvited and proceeded to make the locals' lives a misery with their unfunny, self-obsessed antics. As for his courses, Thom quickly became disillusioned with them too. Studying English literature seemed pointless, and he soon decided that he had no great talent for painting either. His big influence at the time was Francis Bacon, and his palette was chiefly limited to red, white and black. The only good painting I did during the first year was this guy blowing his brains out, he later recalled. It wasn't that Thom was unappreciative of the opportunities available to him. It was just that he felt out of place, a feeling that has dogged him his whole life. Exeter University's art department, he later said, seemed like a combination of a finishing school for upper-class idiots and one of the most exciting environments he'd ever been in. He was given complete creative freedom to do whatever he wanted, but this posed the question of why one had to go to art school to artificially create such a situation. Why couldn't life be like that all the time? Meanwhile, Thom's eccentric dress sense and confrontational nature continued to get him into trouble. One night he was approached by 3 blokes who took exception to his grandad coat and hat. Thom responded by blowing them a kiss and suffered a severe beating for his troubles. From that point on, he tried his best to avoid such unwelcome attention, and indeed seems to have retreated into himself again, his introspective streak encouraged by his increased alcohol consumption. He would get drunk, stay in his room and write songs. At Exeter, Thom joined a band called Headless Chickens, playing guitar and singing alongside lead vocalist and bass player Simon Shackleton, violinist John Mathias, and a drummer called Howard. The group originally just performed cover versions. Their rendition of Prince's Raspberry Beret is fondly remembered, but soon began writing original material, including a Thom Yorke composition entitled High and Dry. Although they only performed about 20 gigs, they contributed a track to a split 7-inch EP on a local punk label, Hometown Atrocities, appearing alongside fellow Exeter outfits Mad at the Sun, Beaver Patrol and Jackson Penis. The Headless Chickens track, I Don't Want to Go to Woodstock, was rousing melodic punk, reminiscent of the Psychedelic Furs or The Alarm. 1,000 copies of the EP were produced, 50 in a green picture sleeve, bearing a photo of Kylie Minogue and the legend, A Disgrace to the Corpse of Kylie. The band later shortened their name to Headless after discovering that there was already a New Zealand band called Headless Chickens, and by 1991, Headless evolved into a more experimental, crusty techno project called Flicker Noise. But they only played 1 gig before Thom finished his degree and returned to Oxford. Headless violinist John Matthias would later play on the Radiohead album The Bends, while Simon Shackleton went on to form the big beat trip-hop hybrid Lunatic Calm in 1996, whose track Leave You Far Behind featured on the soundtracks to The Matrix, Charlie's Angels and Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Thom, like many other students at the time, was growing increasingly interested in the acid house boom then sweeping the country, and began DJing at Exeter University's Lemon Grove club, the Lemmy. He became something of a cult figure on campus and was soon spending a huge amount of money on Dance 12 Inches as attendance at his weekly nights over 4 months grew from 200 to over 1,000 people. It was his first modest taste of stardom, and he found that he quite liked it. Meanwhile, Thom had been pursuing a fellow student named Rachel Owen for some time. He later remembered that he was terrified of her, but he was tenacious and dogged in his own funny way, while she thought he was moody, difficult, unpleasant, idiotic, freakish and impossible to talk to, which Thom concedes was probably an accurate description. But they eventually got together, and according to Thom, she knocked a lot of that out of him. The couple were evidently soulmates, as Rachel would go on to become Thom's long-term partner and the mother of his children. It was also at Exeter that the singer met fellow student Dan Rickwood, who from 1994 would collaborate with Thom on Radiohead's sleeve art under the pseudonym Stanley Donwood, with Thom using a variety of aliases, such as the White Chocolate Farm or Dr. Choc. Donwood would become almost an unofficial sixth member of Radiohead, often sitting in on rehearsal sessions and sketching his interpretation of the music, which would in turn influence Thom's lyrics and the song's final structure. During his final years at Exeter, the college art department acquired several Apple Macintosh computers with state-of-the-art design software. Thom had already concluded that he wasn't much of a painter, and so he leapt at the chance to use computer technology instead on his final year project. That was to be a digital reproduction of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, which he scanned onto the hard drive and then changed all the colours, calling it his own.
I mean, that was born out of the anger of watching heads of state around the globe saying, yes, we really must do something about this. Meanwhile, here are the latest growth figures, and no one actually grappling with the wider questions. Everyone just sort of shuffling little bits of paper around on the table going, yeah, we really need to do something about this.
Returning from Exeter, Thom moved into a communal semi-detached house on Ridgefield Road in the centre of Oxford, which Phil, Colin and Ed were already renting. Johnny soon moved in as well. Thom was working at a second-hand clothes shop and putting all his energies into relaunching On a Friday. In a precursor of their later tendency to play acoustic shows together, Thom and Johnny also began busking on the streets of Oxford, suffering the indignity of the local tramps throwing 2p pieces at them, while passers-by only gave them money if they played well-known REM songs. They didn't have to worry too much though, as On a Friday were gradually getting noticed. A series of demo tapes gained them a management team in the form of two local music producers, Chris Hufford and Bryce Edge, who had once been signed to EMI as part of a failed new romantic group called Aerial FX. They in turn managed to drum up serious record company interest in the band, and at the end of 1991, On a Friday, signed a deal with EMI subsidiary Parlophone. The first thing EMI insisted on was that On a Friday change their name, and reportedly handed them a list of 5 alternative suggestions and told them to pick one. Thus, On a Friday became Radiohead, and the rest is history. After an initial lack of success in their home country, Radiohead's second single, Creep, was picked up by an American alternative radio station, and the band was launched into a huge promotional and touring campaign in the States that nearly destroyed them. Creep was a worldwide hit and made the UK top 10 on its second release, but lukewarm reviews for Radiohead's debut album, Pablo Honey, reinforced suspicions that the band could turn out to be a one-hit wonder. For the Creep guys, that song had become an albatross around their necks. Thom had written Creep while at Exeter University, reportedly about a girl that he was interested in but who wasn't interested in him. While many have taken the song's apparent self-loathing at face value, it is in fact deeply sarcastic. Thom neither believes he's a creep or that the girl he's singing to is an angel, and she's certainly not perfect. In fact, a contemporary of Thom's at Exeter alleges that the line, "Your skin makes me cry," is a cruel reference to the fact that the girl in question suffered badly from eczema. In short, she thought that she was too good for him, but the song, especially when it became a huge worldwide hit, was Thom's ultimate passive-aggressive revenge. Revenge came with a price, however. The band had to pull out of the 1993 Reading Festival due to Thom suffering from laryngitis brought on by the stress induced during their American tour. The same stress caused a muscular and nervous tension that made his neck feel as hard as concrete, as he began feeling that in return for their American success, the band somehow owed someone something, but he couldn't work out who or how much. Radiohead took a much-needed break at the end of 1993, and Thom took the opportunity to buy a modest house in the Oxford suburb of Headington for himself and Rachel. He christened it the house that Creep built. By all accounts, Thom found it hard to depressurise and return to normal life when he came back from being on tour, an experience he would later write about on The Bends, using a metaphor for the affliction that deep-sea divers suffer from if they ascend too quickly. He had come to believe his own press and continued to act out the role of tortured, sensitive artist and egotistical rock star even when he came home. He later admitted that he was completely unbearable. Matters probably weren't helped by the inexplicable glam rock hairdo Thom adopted during 1993, a teased, crimped and back-combed explosion of peroxide blonde locks that made him look like he was trying out for Hanoi Rocks. As 1994 began, Thom Yorke had got everything he wanted, but was a confused and self-destructive mess. Success, it turned out, was not the answer, but the beginning of a whole new set of problems.
You know, one of the other formative things that was happening at the time was I was getting more heavily involved with Friends of the Earth, and the initial IPCC report came out, which is International Panel on Climate Change, and it had all these graphs that all just go like that, with global temperatures and so on and so on, and I was looking at that, I'm trying not to look at it actually, and that had a huge effect on me.
Thom felt under great pressure to follow up the success of Creep and prove that the band were not just a one-hit wonder. At the same time, he was determined to get as far away from the sound and the public perception of that song as possible. The sessions for their second album, begun in 1994 with legendary producer John Leckie, were exceedingly fraught, with Thom driving himself incredibly hard while not much actually got done. The band was simultaneously perfectionist yet confused about the direction they should be taking, with Thom coming in at 9 o'clock every morning and playing the piano for 4 hours solid before the rest of the band and the producer arrived at 1. But 2 months into the sessions, Thom was seriously considering scrapping all the songs they'd worked on so far and replacing them with a new batch as yet unwritten. The turning point came when Leckie suggested that Thom should record some of his songs by himself, just singing and playing on acoustic guitars. The first song completed in this way was the magnificent Fake Plastic Trees, with Thom's astonishing vocal performance inspired by witnessing a show by the legendary Jeff Buckley the previous night. The resulting album, The Bends, was the release that really put Radiohead on the map, entering the UK charts at number 6 in March 1995 and receiving rave reviews in the music press and broadsheet newspapers alike. It would go on to be regularly voted one of the greatest albums of all time, but emerging as it did at the high watermark of Britpop, it wasn't immediately a huge commercial breakthrough for the band. A gruelling live schedule was necessary to promote the album, especially in America, where Radiohead toured 6 times during the Bends era. Thom particularly hated the industry showcases and meet and greets he was required to be involved in, which usually demanded an acoustic set from him and Johnny, something he felt was artificial, contrived and misrepresented what the band was all about. And despite all this hard work, the Bends was still a relative flop in the US. Thom suffered from the constant touring in other ways too. Too much time spent on aeroplanes caused fluid to settle in his ears, which affected his singing and made him fear that he was going deaf. He was dismayed that the band's US shows were attracting what he termed sports jocks, an aggressive crowd into getting drunk and moshing at the front of the stage, pushing the real fans out of the way. Behaviour more suited to a heavy metal concert than the arena of alternative rock. In New York, Thom had what he termed a complete breakdown and was begging Radiohead's tour manager to book him a flight back home immediately. 4 months later in Munich, Thom was suffering once again from laryngitis, and he blacked out on stage from a combination of illness, fatigue and anxiety, collapsing 3 songs into the show. More positive news arrived when it was announced that Radiohead had been picked to open for their heroes R.E.M. on the European leg of the latter band's Monster Tour. The 2 groups soon bonded, with Thom and R.E.M. vocalist Michael Stipe forming a particularly close and long-lasting friendship. It was Stipe who counselled Yorke on how to cope with fame, success and the rigours of life on the road while remaining a sane, creative and down-to-earth person. He continues to be someone Yorke turns to for advice to this day, almost as an older brother figure, one who has been through the madness while retaining a high degree of privacy, integrity and self-respect, and who is still pushing the boundaries creatively and enjoying what they do. 1996 was largely spent recording the follow-up to the Bends, which the band had decided to produce themselves in collaboration with engineer Nigel Godrich. The sessions were typically tense and fraught, but Radiohead's 3rd album, OK Computer, was released in June 1997 to an overwhelming critical response. Although initially considered difficult, complex and even pretentious, it was soon almost universally declared the album of the decade, if not the century, and became an unexpectedly massive seller too, finally pushing Radiohead into the big time. The atmosphere during the gruelling world tour to promote OK Computer was captured in a video released in 1999 called Meeting People is Easy, which showed possibly the least likely rock gods ever coming to terms with global stardom, not through throwing TVs out of hotel windows and indulging in drug and groupie-filled orgies, but through adjusting to an endless routine of boredom, repetition, alienation, ennui and gradually feeling yourself turning into a commodity instead of a human being. Thom, in particular, later revealed that the OK Computer tour left him in a state of deep depression and anxiety over the way the band's music seemed to be treated as a secondary concern, while everybody seemed to want a piece of him personally. It was literally as though he was losing his soul.